Okay, so thank you to everyone who's joining us for this seminar in our Anthropocene Histories series at UCL. We're very pleased to welcome you to Eco-Critical Approaches to Art History. We have three fantastic speakers. In this seminar, we're exploring how eco-critical thinking is reshaping art history across different periods and materials. We're going to have the speakers in chronological order. So starting with Bob and then Alan and then Esme. And I wanted to start with a quotation about eco-critical thinking, which is a paraphrase from Alan Braddock's amazing exhibition catalogue. Just to start us thinking, we will have all three speakers speaking one after each other, and then we'll have all the questions at the end, but we have 2 hours, so there'll be plenty of time for questions, and I look forward very much to everyone's questions and responses. So eco-criticism is a mode of cultural inquiry, and I've now, that developed from literary studies and environmental history during the early 1990s. It looks beyond conventional humanistic frameworks to emphasize interconnectedness and environmental justice. In art history, eco-criticism considers artifacts of every category as embodying environmental conditions, beliefs, attitudes, and assumptions. And so this is a new and I think very important movement within many fields. And here we're going to discuss art history, and I look forward very much to the speakers' contributions. We're starting with Professor Bob Mills. He's a professor of medieval studies at UCL in the art history department. He has important publications in the histories of gender and sexuality, and is currently completing a monograph on wild forms in medieval art, from which this talk will be related to, which focuses on imagery of wildness and the non-human in Britain circa 1200 to 1500. And the title of Bob's talk is Eco-Criticism, Wildness and Medieval Rock Art.
Okay, thanks very much, Sophie, for the introduction. Thanks also for organising this session along with John, and for Catherine for her help as well. And it's a really great pleasure to be on this panel with Esme and Alan. Alan and I have never met, but Esme and I know each other quite well because we're in the same department at UCL. Yes, eco-criticism, wildness and medieval rock art. So the material I'm presenting today is part of this larger book project that Sophie mentioned on visual cultures of wildness in medieval England. Current notions of wildness are shadowed by deployments of this category in early English, linked etymologically with the idea of will. The Old English adjective wild was originally applied to non-human entities such as animals, plants, and landscapes perceived as willful or unruly. The noun wilderness, which was first recorded around 1230, described areas that remained uncultivated and uninhabited, at least by humans, and were effectively beyond the pale. It follows that as a category that defies efforts to contain it, wildness is essentially resistant to artistic expression. At least that's how the story goes. My book's working title, Wild Forms, plays on this paradox. How is a phenomenon associated with a boundless outside brought within the domain of artifice? When, how, and why did wildness acquire a cultivated form? Taking stock of recent efforts to foreground human intention and creativity in histories of medieval art, I've also been engaging with examples and interpretive frameworks that potentially complicate this narrative. And this is where eco-criticism comes in. Eco-criticism is a method originally developed in literary studies, but increasingly being adopted by art historians, that attends to art's ecology, its place within the mesh of materials that surround it, the landscapes within which it's commissioned and created. and the experiences and imagery of nature and the non-human engender. Eco-criticism highlights the role of the physical environment itself in shaping art and architecture, potentially stimulating new insights into the relationship between visual culture as a repository of human craft and wildness as a domain of seemingly unassimilable non-human difference. Perhaps the most well-known instance of this dialogue between wildness and cultivation in the Middle Ages is the foliate decoration that's characteristic of Gothic architecture. So I'm showing here some photographs of the celebrated leaf sculptures in South Westminster's 13th century chapter house. Famously, in 1945, Nicholas Pesner published a study of the so-called leaves of Southwell, illustrated with a series of extraordinary photographs by the historian Frederick Attenborough, who happens to be father of a rather well-known naturalist, David. Highlighting the subtle carving's significance as, and I'm quoting Pesner here, one of the purest symbols surviving in Britain of Western thought in its loftiest mode. Pesner stressed the sculptor's agency and, as he puts it, genius in bringing vegetal matter into the domain of style. My book will be devoting a chapter to Gothic foliage, but what I want to do is to seek to reposition it within a broader ecosystem of human and non-human entities, including the multitude of faces, vegetal heads, animals and habitats depicted among the leaves themselves, which Pesner largely ignores. But I'm not going to talk about this material today. Today, I want to introduce another set of examples that have to date been virtually ignored in mainstream surveys of art in medieval Britain. The works in question comprise a series of rock-cut hermitages in central and northern England, whose carved interiors seem physically to trouble the distinction between art and objecthood that's traditionally been a mainstay of art history. And so the slide I'm showing now shows a selection of the sites I've been researching, just to give you a preliminary sense of their locations and also what, as you can see, are their perhaps ostensibly artless status. Clearly, these structures can't compete in scale, variety, expense, quality, or ambition with the great churches such as South Westminster that attract the lion's share of art historical interest. Nor do they compare favourably with even the smaller churches and chapels that peppered large swathes of the medieval English landscape. Yet what distinguishes rock-cut hermitages from other varieties of religious building is the degree to which they appear to exploit wildness, not simply as a human construct that can be aestheticized and tamed, as is arguably the case with Pesner's Leaves of Southwell, but also as a potential signifier of non-human otherness and difference. And my wager is that eco-critical frameworks might be able to bring this dynamic into sharper focus. And here, and I hope he's not embarrassed by this reference, but I've been inspired particularly by the work of one of our other speakers today, Alan Braddock, who in his 2023 book, Implication, critiques the objectifying tendencies of the discipline, whereby all the non-human phenomena involved in the creation and reception of art are viewed mechanistically as inert, passive matter, while art itself is treated as the more than material product of human beings alone. Demonstrating the roots of these tendencies in Kantian aesthetics, which contrast lifeless matter and irrational animals with rational, purposive humans, Braddock finds reverberations of this line of thinking in the writings of influential art historians, the likes of Michael Fried, who, following Kant, are similarly invested in Judeo-Christian ideas of human exceptionalism and power over nature. And Braddock concludes his critique of this objectifying impulse by briefly contemplating a large, vertically oriented piece of perforated limestone, which at some unknown date during the Chinese Qing dynasty was removed from a freshwater lake and placed on display. Such gongxi, or scholars' rocks as they became known, have since at least the 10th century been prized by collectors for their aesthetically pleasing and lively qualities. What makes these stones relevant to a wider argument about eco-critical methods is the acknowledgement that both human and non-human agencies are implicated in their production and reception. As Braddock puts it, they're complex hybrids, neither strictly art nor object in the Kantian sense. What would Kant and his intellectual descendants say about such art created and appreciated as a synthesis of human and non-human agencies, wherein Western notions of intention, genius, and material transcendence don't strictly apply? I suggest that related questions can be posed about rock-cut hermitages in medieval England. To what extent were these places created and appreciated as a synthesis of human and non-human agencies? Do the sites in question exemplify art, objecthood, or both? Now, just as I'm only going to have time to introduce a couple of examples very briefly, and I found it really difficult to choose which of my examples because they all work in different ways towards this larger argument. But hopefully the examples I have selected will give a taste of the wider phenomenon and its potential susceptibility to eco-critical approaches. The first example is a site that appears to exemplify directly the wild forms that are the focus of my research, insofar as it features a sculpture carved directly into the rock itself. So what you're seeing here now is Crackcliffe Rocks in Derbyshire, which contains on its western face an artificial cave allegedly used by medieval hermits. The cave features a low bench cut directly into the rock that could have been used by the inhabitant as a seat or possibly as a support for sleeping. Still visible on the exterior are traces of chiseled grooves and slots for timber beams, suggesting the presence of a covered annex positioned against the cave's entrance. East of this, there are also signs of another wooden structure with a steeply pitched roof, likely reflecting the division of oratory and living quarters witnessed at comparable sites across England. We don't have the names for any of the individuals who inhabited Crackcliffe Rocks in the Middle Ages, but Stewart's accounts for Haddon Hall, which is a medieval manor house located just a few miles north, include reference to a payment being made in December 1549 to the hermit for bringing a quantity of rabbits to Haddon. While the precise identity and place of residence of this individual in the records is unclear, the use of a definite article, the hermit, suggests that he was local and known to the steward recording the relevant entry, and that he likely resided in the nearby hermitage at Crackcliffe. This cave's most remarkable feature is a high-relief sculpture of Christ crucified on the cave's east wall. This striking image, well over a metre in height, is again carved directly into the rock face. The relief is positioned so that the devotee could see it from the ledge carved in the chamber's opposite wall. Despite showing signs of wear and damage likely caused by later users of the cave, it exerts a lively presence. Christ's loincloth has visible pleats indicative of fabric, and while his facial features are extremely worn, it seems that he may be wearing a crown of thorns, his neck bent slightly to denote his suffering and humanity. Now, those details are reasonably conventional, but intriguingly, the base of the crucifix appears above a protruding platform of bare rock, which potentially alludes iconographically to the mountain of Golgotha. The moss and lichen that encrusts parts of the rocky platform contribute further to this illusion, suggesting that the sculptor has deliberately endeavored to harness elements in the natural environment as a means of contributing to the image's meaning and effective charge. In the 14th century, new rules were implemented to structure the life of hermits in England after centuries when the practice had largely been unregulated, and at least one of these rules instructed solitaries to place on their altar an image of Christ hanging from the cross as a focus for devotion and imitation. Significantly, in addition to conforming to such instructions, the Crackcliffe carving shows Christ hanging from a verdant cross, sprouting stylized leaves, participating in a tradition whereby a symbol of death proclaims the vitality of life. So the image I'm showing on the left of the slide, a miniature in an early 14th century prayer book with links to East Anglia, shows Christ crucified on a tree sprouting branches, decorated with phrases recording key events in Christ's life. Based on a treatise by a Franciscan theologian, Bonaventure, which uses the metaphor of a tree as a mnemonic aid to encourage meditation on Christ's life, passion, and resurrection. The miniature also points to the meditative potential of the Crackcliffe carving. And then in the center of the slide, I've reproduced another rendition of the motif. This time it's in stone. This is an elaborately decorated coffin lid in a Worcestershire parish church. This carving features a sculpture of Christ crucified on a cross decorated with crockets representing felled branches. A pair of doves fly upwards from Christ's head, seemingly in the direction of the couple who are buried in the tomb, while at the meeting point of the canopies in the top of the cross is a green man whose mouth sprouts leaves. The visual parallels between this carving and the Crackcliffe carving is noteworthy and may point to a comparable date for the latter. But translating such imagery to a cave in Derbyshire arguably also speaks to the hermit's perception that the environment in which he lived and prayed was itself freighted with significance as a vital entity, an index of Christ's capacity to enliven even rigid stone. Other medieval rock-cut buildings in England incorporate even grander sculptural schemes, again carved directly into the rocks, that also house places of worship, along with spaces for domestic use. These include instances of rock art linked to aristocratic patrons, which harness the perceived rude qualities of wildness, seemingly as a means of enhancing the respective site's prestige, and by implication, the prestige of their noble sponsors. Notably, there's a large, deep relief carving of an armed knight at Guy's Cliff, a sandstone outcrop overlooking the River Avon, about a mile from central Warwick. The statue, which reputedly depicts Guy of Warwick, a mythic figure who, feeling remorse for his violent past, is said to have lived as a hermit in a nearby cave, has been dated stylistically to the 14th or early 15th centuries. Comparison with other extant medieval rock art in England suggests that the configuration witnessed at sites such as Guy's Cliff and Crackcliffe align with the wider pattern of cave hermitages in the period. But in closing, I also want to acknowledge some potential challenges in filtering such phenomena through an eco-critical prism. For while these sites arguably implicated their original beholders in a sense of other than human wildness, periodically they also betray the persistence of a distinctly anti-environmental ethos. This points to the need for interpretations that remain attuned to the specific contexts in which these hybrid visions of human and non-human agency assumed meaning. So my concluding example is a cave hermitage, also in Derbyshire, near a place called Dale Abbey, which, like several of the sites I've been exploring in this project, has a monastic provenance. The cave itself is situated in a sandstone elevation forming the southern boundary of a marshy valley known as Deepdale. At present, this consists of a single space entered by two doorways, but originally it was probably divided into two chambers, one to the west forming an oratory and the other functioning as living quarters. A niche in the western wall, which could have held a lamp or image, suggests that this usage, though it's unclear whether the carved crosses at each end are medieval or later additions. There's lots of layers of graffiti, as is often the case with these sites, and it's very difficult to date some of this. The ruins of the nearby Abbey of Dale can still be glimpsed from the cave, and while the hermitage itself predates the monastery, it played a key role in Dale's foundation legend. A chronicle produced in the mid-1200s by one of the abbey's canons provides a detailed account of the first 12th century hermit at Dale, a baker from Derby called Cornelius, who, as well as having a reputation for good works, has a particular dedication to the Virgin Mary, One day we're told Mary appears to Cornelius in his sleep and tells him to go to Deepdale, where he'll serve her better serve her and her son in solitude. Awakening, Cornelius sets out on a journey, but not knowing where Deepdale is, miraculously finds his way to a place that the Chronicle describes as marshy and of fearful aspect, whereupon he cut in the mountainside, in the rock, and again quoting the Chronicle here, he cut in the mountainside a tiny dwelling and an altar in which he served God day and night in hunger and thirst, in cold and meditation. Subsequently, after living there a while, Cornelius discovers a spring in a nearby valley and builds himself another oratory and cottage in honor of God and the Virgin. And this is a site that today coincides with the village's diminutive parish church, while the spring Cornelius discovered was also subsequently venerated in the Middle Ages and beyond as a holy well. Dale Hermitage presents many parallels with the other rock structures I've been researching. But another artwork associated with the Abbey also points to the need for a degree of caution when filtering these sites through the prism of their ecology. This is a 15th century stained glass window. It's now in the church of a nearby village, but it was removed from Dale Abbey's cloister after the Reformation. This window records scenes from the life of Robert, a saint whose cave and chapel on the banks of the River Nid in Knaresborough, North Yorkshire, was a key precedent for Dale Hermitage. The scenes in the window convey a legend that a deer came from a forest owned by the Lord of Knaresborough and invaded Robert's crops in the vicinity of the cave where he'd set up as a hermit. And I've reproduced an image of that cave here as it exists today, and the foundations of the chapel that was founded nearby. This cave where he'd set up as a hermit, so the deer invades Robert's crops, tramples and eats them to Robert's great frustration. So Robert basically goes to the Lord and complains, and the Lord says to him, you need to herd and enclose the deer. And Robert accomplishes this. So here he is complaining to the Lord. And then Robert is instructed to herd and enclose the deer, and he accomplishes this seemingly impossible task, causing wonder. And subsequently, and this is the detail I'm showing here, he harnesses the deer to his plough and uses the deer as draft animals to cultivate his land. Robert's miracle was presumably commemorated in Dale Abbey's cloister as it contains echoes of the first hermit of Deepdale's story. Among other things, the chronicle relayed the Abbey's origin story, telling how Cornelius had a run-in with the local lord, who was initially somewhat resistant, as was the Lord of Knaresborough before him, to having a hermit live rent-free on what he considered to be his land. But the story also points to the reception of such narratives by monks whose foundation myth celebrated eremitic spirituality, but weren't committed practitioners themselves. Thus, while hermitages such as Dale serve to connect their original inhabitants with non-human wildernesses of wood, water, earth, and stone, St. Robert's miracle of the ploughing deer suggests that Cornelius's monastic successors persisted in applying a dominant Christian ethos of control over and use of nature. This doesn't detract from these sites' potential to facilitate contemplation of wild places and materials as a springboard to spiritual or other kinds of insight on the part of their inhabitants and visitors. Wild forms, I suggest, were a key dimension of these places too, in ways that potentially resonate with the eco-critical methods currently being developed within art history to bring into view the roles of nature and the non-human in shaping human creative acts. For working against the complex ecologies that these sites potentially exemplify as repositories of uncultivated wildness was a persistent desire to contain and control their materiality, not least by permanently transforming the rocks themselves through the power of human artifice. As such, the celebration of Robert's ploughing miracle at Dale Abbey is a reminder that alongside these eco-critical perspectives, we also need to keep in view the fundamentally un-ecological impulses at work. Rather than simply idealizing the Middle Ages as a time before the relationship to landscape and the natural environment that characterizes European modernity, we need to recall that medieval attitudes have themselves also shaped, informed, and produced those modern attitudes. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, for that fantastic talk. So we'll now move to the second of our third talks, and we'll have questions at the end. Our second speaker is Esme Garlake. She's a PhD student at UCL working on non-human life in early 16th century art. Her PhD is fully funded by UCL Research Excellence Scholarship and is developing an ecocritical methodology that draws upon decolonial and feminist art histories, animal studies, and material studies, as well as current campaigns for climate and social justice. And her talk will be on, I've now put the title away somewhere there. Thank you, Esme. Piero di Cosimo, Renaissance Hero for the Anthropocene, ?
Thank you. I didn't have the original, the question mark wasn't originally there, but I have added it and then we can discuss afterwards. It was originally why he is not the Renaissance hero. Thank you all for having me. And thank you, Bob, for such an interesting talk. And it's great to be here. Piero di Cosimo, over the last 2 decades or so, has been the subject of growing attention. Art historians have sought to recover this Florentine painter from reductive historical narratives, which frequently conflate subject matter with artist. Many of these narratives stem from the charming but largely metaphorical anecdotes in Giorgio Vasari's 1568 biography of Piero, which cast the artist as an eccentric outlier. According to Vasari, Piero was a lover of solitude who led the life of a man who was less man than beast. Apparently, Piero regularly observed animals and plants. He ate nothing but boiled eggs, and he let his garden grow wild. Apparently, it pleased him to see everything wild, like his own nature, and he declared that nature's own things should be left to her to look after, without lifting a hand to them. In 1937, Erwin Panofsky characterized Piero as a primitive, interpreting his secular paintings as the subconscious recollection of a primitive who happened to live in a period of sophisticated civilization. In recent decades, these kind of sweeping characterizations have been rightly interrogated by art historians, with a growing focus on contextualizing Piero's idiosyncrasies within the broader historical moment of late 15th century and early 16th century Florence. So the key painting that I want to focus on today is the Forest Fire, which was made around 1505 in Florence, and it's currently housed in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which is also where I'm from. So I've grown up with this painting. Along with many other paintings by Piero, some of which I've put here just as a quick reference, it emerged from a period of revived interest in Lucretian philosophy in Florence, following the rediscovery of the ancient Roman philosophers De Rerum Natura in 1417. This painting has been grouped often with 2 other Lucretian-themed paintings by Piero, which all offered erudite viewers at the time imaginative visual interpretations of different stages of Lucretius's materialist account of human evolution. And in each, fire plays a significant part, but obviously animals are also central to this. So this was a relatively fleeting moment, but it allowed for a space for conceiving alternative evolutionary narratives outside of, or at least parallel to, Christian frameworks. And it was part of a Renaissance humanism that we don't tend to associate necessarily with the Renaissance, which if we think of, say, the Vitruvian Man as a kind of broader public symbol of the Renaissance, this kind of humanism engaged much more critically with the boundaries of the human and animal. And it's been looked at as a kind of Renaissance post-humanism in recent years. So Piero di Cosimo certainly comes into this, and he's an artist that productively complicates and expands our understandings of Renaissance humanism. And it's unsurprising then that his representations of animals have been increasingly the subject of a variety of studies. But what I'd like to explore today as a way of looking at what eco-criticism might help us with when looking at Piero di Cosimo is the fact that the more effective potential of his animal imagery has often been the cause of what I'd say as a kind of stumbling block for art historians. So sentimental or emotional interpretations tend to take over, and Piero is celebrated as an animal lover and inherently an empath, with a kind of innate connection to animals. So Ianthi Asimapopoulou writes that Piero was perhaps the first painter who saw into the minds of animals and succeeded in expressing their feelings of distress and sorrow. Dennis Geronimus writes that Piero's nervous system was somehow in tune with those of animals, granting him the ability to intuit the workings of their minds and sensations, to understand the secret language of the wild. And these are certainly appealing interpretations, and I think quite beautifully written. But I believe they actually reveal much more about our modern sensibilities than they do the Renaissance viewers at the time. And I think we can't ignore the fact that these kind of interpretations are emerging during the Anthropocene, not just at a time of planetary collapse and the terrifying realities that that brings, but also in terms of the intellectual challenge that this age represents for the humanities more generally, in which the category of the human is under increasingly intense scrutiny. But the fact that these interpretations are coming at a time of climate breakdown and during the Anthropocene is never actually explicitly acknowledged. And therefore, an empathetic reading of Piero's animal imagery comes to be seen as something that's innate in the image itself. So I would like to propose today and open up the question that eco-criticism as a methodology that inherently grapples with the differences between the present and the past, current and past environmental contexts, offers a useful framework for recognizing how original viewers may have responded differently or similarly to this affective animal imagery. I'd like to just share some of my findings and then have a bit of a reflection at the end about eco-criticism in art history more generally, particularly for this period. So beginning with this painting itself, it of course shows a forest on fire with flames of red, orange and white flickering out of a dark mass of trees right in the center. Animals and birds on either side of the forest flee in panic, with deer leaping over water and lines of birds weaving through the sky over distant blue mountains. Trees form brackets around the scene. On the left, a number of birds have gathered on bare branched trees. And in the foreground, we see a bear with its cubs emerging from a hill below, encountering an arched-backed lion. We have a bellowing buffalo, a lioness with her mouth open and her paw raised, a crane with its neck to the sky. Humans are present, but they're not protagonists. In the middle ground, we have this shepherd pointing towards a hut in the background where people and a dog have registered the fire and are busy pulling water from a well. On the other side of the middle ground, we have these strange creatures, a pair of pigs, one with a human face looking directly at the viewer, and next to that, a walking deer and a human-faced stag. And a lot has been written on these, but today I will be focusing not on these hybrid human-animal images, but specifically on the animal images themselves. So for any reading of this painting, it's really essential to understand that we're looking at what's called a spalliera painting. So this was a horizontal painting intended to form part of the decorative scheme of the camera, which was a bedroom or bedroom antechamber in a wealthy private residence in Florence and across Italy at this time, usually an urban palazzo. So spalliera panels were embedded into a room's wainscoting or woodwork. They may have been on the back of a day bed, as you see here to the left, or they may have been on the back above a bed or mounted above a cassone, which you see here to the right. So it was intended to be displayed in any case at shoulder height, so you could really get close to this image. And the period of popularity of these panels spanned Piero di Cosimo's working career from around 1480 to 1520, at a time when a number of private buildings and palazzi were being constructed across Florence. And you can notice these examples I've included here, one of which to the right is by Piero di Cosimo, they're much more conventional spalliera panels in that they are grounded in this architectural geometry, which has quite a stabilizing effect. And in contrast, I would argue that the forest fire represents a kind of inversion or an anti-urban equivalent of the spalliera genre. So it's also important, as I again enter into more specifics on the animal imagery, that the people viewing this work would have varied in age, gender, and also possibly social standing if we consider domestic employees. The camera was a bedroom, but it also was a place where political meetings or informal events took place, and it was often redecorated at the time of a new marriage, which again kind of introduces a different viewer, potentially the wife of the household, the homeowner. And it was a scene that this scene would have, because people could get close to it, it really is a kind of bewildering scene. And I think anybody who will have seen this in real life will understand just how much this image encroaches on the viewer. It is certainly affecting, destabilizing, but within this, I really want to think about what the original viewers may have been thinking about the animals that we see here, and whether they would have shared the potentially more empathetic view that we do today, or that's been put forward by other art historians. So I propose that we kind of take it back to basics and simply look at these animals as inhabitants of a forest environment. And that environment for Renaissance viewers at the time would have been closely connected with notions of ferocity, or what was called ferocità. So in many literary sources, perhaps most famously in the opening of Dante's Inferno, the danger of the forest environment derived from a lack of visibility. Its density and overgrown terrain presented a physically and psychologically challenging place to navigate, and a space in which animal predators could suddenly emerge out of hiding. This is seen in many episodes of the Hypnoteromachia Polifili, which is a lengthy book attributed to Francesco Colonna and published in Venice in 1499, so just a few years before the forest fire was painted. At the beginning, the protagonist Polifilo describes his terror of being lost in the mythical Hercyan forest, where there was nothing but the lairs of dangerous beasts and caverns full of noxious creatures and fierce monsters. Later, in the most gruesome scene of the book, Polifilo witnesses nymphs being dismembered and killed in a vividly brutal attack by a pack of many fierce animals. Bristling famished hounds, sharp-fanged lions, howling wolves, rapacious eagles, hungry kites, and hissing vultures. Of course, the animals in the forest fire are not explicitly attacking each other or humans, as we see in another spalliera example here above, which is a hunting scene by Piero. However, the open mouths of the animals does emphasize the ferocity of the lions, birds of prey, and bears. And it emphasized for viewers at the time, I would argue, that these belong to a threatening and dangerous environment. Of course, what's important to note is that these animals are exposed and vulnerable. They have been evacuated from the forest, and so possibly would have appeared less threatening than, say, the one we previously saw in the hunting scene. And it's this process of making visible usually hidden and ferocious animals which led me to start thinking about another environment which would have been significant for viewers at the time, which is the space of the piazza. For elite members of Italian society during this period, ferocious animals were not just enjoyed in representations such as this one, but also in actual organised fights between a menagerie of animals on special civic occasions. And this very consciously drew on traditions between fighting between animals in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So a key source for me in this sense was Leonoranze Fiorentine, which is an anonymous account of a series of entertainments organized by the Medici family in 1459. This was to welcome the Pope Pius II and also Galeazzo Sforza from another court. And so I've included a picture here. This is a famous image of the Piazza della Signoria. It's actually Savonarola's execution, but I wanted to include it to emphasize the kind of hyper visibility of the piazza space. And just the connection between animal visibility and then entertainment in the piazza. So the author of Leonoranze describes the animals entering the square to fight, and they've been captured and transported from both woods and plains and inserted into the enclosure of the piazza. And one description in particular emphasizes the kind of thrill of animal fighting for people at the time. So the lions took a stroll around the square. The rest just stood there trembling with fear. And then, with a great leap, both high and agile, the great Marzocco, meaning the lion, set upon a horse and showed it was the emperor of beasts. It sank its teeth between the back and body, and you don't need to ask if the horse felt the wound because it spun round at once. The fight ends with the lion leaving, quote, a gaping hole in the horse, which, quote, could have held a hoard of buried treasure. And then the narrator goes on for quite a while, praising the lion's nobility and ferocity and the balance of those. So what's really striking here and important, I think, for thinking about the viewers of the forest fire is that this is an account that clearly describes animal pain and distress, but it's a source of entertainment and pleasure and wonder. So with that in mind, when looking, for example, at the bear and the bear cubs, Renaissance viewers may not necessarily have seen this as such an empathetic expression of grief or sorrow or exhaustion. And this is one of the images that art historians today really focus on with a really empathetic perspective. But instead, the open mouth and this gesture was possibly also a gesture of aggression towards, or at least defense against, the lion that it is encountering. And so with that in mind, all of these open mouths of the different animals and the fact that they've all been brought into such close proximity starts to be less about empathy and distress and more about the thrill of looking at what happens when we bring animals together in a confined space. Of course, in this painting, the premise for that is the forest fire. In Leonoranze, it's the fact the enclosure is human-made. But in this painting, we see how the affective pleasures of the sound and sensations and the spectacle of animal confrontation is mapped onto a kind of pre-Christian world, to be enjoyed really within the camera setting. And it's also, I think, useful to, again, return to the camera as an environment. It was this place where encounters also happened, and where ideas and conversations would be taking place, and lots of different images were across this decorative scheme and in conversation with each other as well. So before just concluding with a couple of reflections, which brings us back to the present more, I do want to just acknowledge that the fact that this was a family unit, the bear, may have had some sympathetic responses from some viewers, but possibly from a more anthropomorphic lens. And I think that's something that is really important to recognize. And I know Alan has written very usefully about anthropomorphism and the possibilities of this for thinking about non-human animal experiences and perceptions. And it's something that I think, yeah, I've looked at more, but won't have time to talk through today. The point of this image really, I think, is the ambiguity which was inherent in it from the start. This was intended to be a conversation piece for the camera. So by way of conclusion, I think I'd like to just end with a bit of an anecdote about my own personal responses to this painting. So after I finished my undergraduate degree, I worked as a gallery assistant in the Ashmolean Museum for about a year. And at the same time, I was getting involved with Extinction Rebellion actions. I've included some here, photos from the October 2019 occupation of various parts of London. And for me, this was a period in my life where the scales had fallen, and I was seeing the world through this very intense lens of climate catastrophe, but also the kind of excitement of what it feels like to see the world through that kind of truth, and the new ways of seeing it. So I was moving around the gallery on my shifts, and I was looking for different artworks and objects which would help to, I suppose it was the beginning of wanting to find an eco-critical lens for different artworks. And it was trying to find connections between artworks and historical ways of understanding the environment in its broadest sense. So I obviously for me at the time, the forest fire was the standout for me. It did the searching for me. It presented me with this world on fire and an image of the destruction that brings for humans and animals and the land. And when I would tell people, as I started my MA and then was applying for my PhD, I would tell people about my interest in Italian Renaissance art through eco-criticism, and people would often point me to this painting. So last year, I eventually embarked on the research, and some of which I have presented today. And I really thought that I would end up in a different place. I really thought this was going to do the speaking about our environmental concerns today. But I realized that not only was that assumption kind of already implicit in a lot of the art historical studies, as I discussed at the beginning, about animal empathetic views of animals and this innate connection with animals that Piero di Cosimo apparently had. I realized that actually it didn't leave a lot of room for thinking about the original viewers at the time. And I think that eco-criticism, although it's in some ways ironic that it's so grounded in our moment of climate collapse and the Anthropocene, it actually as a methodology therefore allowed me to really think about historical difference and to try and get me to leave my own emotional responses, put them on hold in some way. So that was how I felt more able to think about ferocity or the piazza. And I realized that the appeal of so many of these environments, the camera, the forest as a dangerous place, and the piazza, many of these are not actually particularly immediate for the modern viewer. And so, although Piero di Cosimo, I think, in many ways can be held up as a figure for the Anthropocene, it needs to be left as a projection. And if we're going to, from an art historical perspective, look at his imagery, then we really, I think, eco-criticism can really help us to maintain the historical distance necessary, and also make space for difference in that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Esme. That was brilliant, and really introducing a completely new way of looking at that amazing painting. So we're now moving forward in time to the late 19th century, and I'm very happy to introduce Alan Braddock, who is the Ralph H. Wark Professor of Art History, Environmental Humanities and American History at William and Mary in Virginia. He is the author and co-editor of several important books that really made eco-criticism an exciting movement in art history, and also an award-winning exhibition, Nature's Nation, American Art and the Environment. And a recent book I think many of us here have been influenced by as well, an eco-critical dictionary for art history. And I will mention finally the current book project on gun vision, ballistic imagination in the first American avant-garde, which also sounds really fascinating. And Alan will talk to us today about looking at cows, reanimating gelatin, the biopolitics of photographic emulsion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sophie, and to your fellow organizers, John and Catherine, for organizing this fantastic event. And I've really enjoyed hearing the presentations by John and Esme, which I think are models of eco-critical interpretation brought into the historical sphere. The presentation I want to offer today it comes from an essay in a forthcoming anthology on photography and ecology in the American West, a book edited by Carolyn Gergen and Monica Bravo for the University of Leuven Press that will come out in 2026. And the essay and this presentation are motivated by a general desire to bring eco-critical art history into conversation with animal studies. And I think we've already seen examples of that rapprochement in the previous presentations. So let me get started. I begin with two photographs of Yosemite Valley in California made a few decades apart. It left a picture from the 1870s or 1880s by Carlton Watkins showing a view down the valley from Union Point. At right, a view of the valley by George Eastman, founder of Eastman Kodak, taken during a trip to California in 1913. Both photographs depict an iconic park in the American West using classic conventions of landscape representation, with vertical elements in nature framing a panoramic view and invoking a nationalized romantic sublime. In their depiction of a famous place, these photographs suggest thematic and compositional continuity, prompting the usual interpretive considerations regarding the history of national parks, environmental conservation, colonial settlement, and the like. Yet, an exclusively iconographic or representational approach to understanding these apparently similar images overlooks substantial differences between them in materials and processes, differences that embody significant changes in photographic production and related supply chains over time. A key distinction concerns their different photographic emulsions. The work it left by Watkins is an albumin print, made by exposing an emulsion of egg white and chloride on a heavy glass plate that needed to be coated with a light-sensitive silver nitrate solution just before use. Eastman's picture at right was made with an emulsion of silver halide crystals suspended in gelatin and dried on film, requiring no liquid sensitization prior to exposure. In other words, whereas Watkins had to carry cumbersome equipment and apply wet chemicals when taking his picture, Eastman could simply point and shoot with a portable Kodak camera containing ready-made dry gelatin film, then develop the image later at his leisure. The implications of this difference are profound and far-reaching. In this presentation, I focus on gelatin and its emergence as the dominant emulsion material in photography during the late 19th century, when it largely replaced albumin and other substances, thanks in no small part to the commercial innovations of George Eastman. Throughout the 19th century, gelatin was made of both plant and animal matter for various purposes, including uses in food and pharmaceuticals. But Eastman and his scientists at Kodak were innovative in crafting photographic gelatin from specially purified collagen that originated in cow bones and cow hides obtained from industrial slaughterhouses and tanneries. At left, you see illustrations from a 20th century Kodak magazine showing scenes of the company's photographic gelatin production. Below, a vat of cow hides being washed, and above, a conveyor belt with a never-ending stream of cow bones to be crushed and treated with steam, acid, and other chemical processes. At right, the finished product appears in a liquid emulsion poured from a beaker in an Eastman Museum demonstration video about gelatin dry plate photography. After the liquid gelatin silver emulsion was coated onto a photographic plate or film surface, it dried without losing sensitivity to light and could be taken almost anywhere. Animal-based gelatin thus provided a stable, portable, and commercially abundant emulsion material, the convenience of which cannot be overstated. By making it possible to expose pictures on dry, portable glass plates or film without the need for wet chemicals, gelatin facilitated a revolution in consumer access to the medium, epitomized in Kodak's famous advertising slogan, "You press the button, we do the rest," referring to how Eastman's company ingeniously decoupled the taking of snapshots from the messy front and back end processes of coating exposure surfaces and developing them. By the late 19th century, consumers could simply shoot pictures and send their Kodak camera back to the company for printing, after which the device was returned newly loaded with film. Gelatin enabled this with its stability and portability. These advantageous properties allowed gelatin silver printing to dominate photography for over a century into the digital era. An eco-critical perspective on gelatin invites us to think about materiality and animality together by looking beyond familiar anthropocentric considerations about artistic style, representation, and humanistic social context. Instead of viewing gelatin as a neutral substance of marginal interest, I want to center and politicize this essential material by interpreting its production, ubiquity, and seeming invisibility as epitomizing reification, capitalism's tendency to transform labor and living beings into exchangeable commodities while concealing knowledge and historical memory of them. To counteract this reifying tendency, I use eco-critical strategies for reanimating gelatin and tracing aspects of its commodity chain to recover what I call the biopolitics of photographic emulsion. Of course, the medium of photography enjoys a long-standing reputation for enhancing visibility by augmenting the powers of human perception, as in the famous 19th century chronophotographic and animal locomotion experiments conducted by Edward Muybridge and Etienne Jules Marey, who used cameras to reveal phases of movement in horses, humans, and other creatures that were invisible to the naked eye. And yet photography has concealed much about its material constituents and processes. This much is clear from Siobhan Angus's 2024 book, Camera Geologica, which examines the extractivist underpinnings and environmental effects of photography in detail, noting, quote, "Of all mediums, it is the most effective at concealing its materiality," end quote. The focus of Angus's investigation, however, is the industrial mine, not the slaughterhouse, as a key site of photographic extraction. Except for very brief introductory remarks about animal material, Angus concentrates on subterranean substances: bitumen, silver, platinum, iron, uranium, and rare earth elements. As a result, her book exemplifies a certain tendency in ecocriticism to sidestep non-human life and emphasizing what I would call terrestrial materiality, as opposed to the sentient vitality that figures prominently in critical animal studies. As I said before, the presentations you've just heard push against that tendency to sidestep the animal. As the product of animal slaughter, gelatin invites analysis from an ecocritical perspective attentive to matters of animality, to counteract the reification of sentient life as a central component in photographic production. By connecting the dots between photography's immanent and seemingly invisible material infrastructure, the emulsion, and its consumer commodity, the image, ecocriticism here forges an interesting rapprochement, not only with critical animal studies, but also aspects of Marxist analysis. Accordingly, I take a cue from the literature scholar Nicole Shukin, whose 2009 book, Animal Capital, contains this brief but provocative statement about photographic gelatin. And I quote, "It is here in the material convolutions of film stock that a transfer of life from animal body to technological media passes virtually without notice. One needs to tease out the animal ingredients of film stock via a material history of photographic gelatin. Gelatin can be excavated as one site where the production of capitalist culture can be seen to always involve the rendering of nature," end quote. As a scholar of literature, Shukin discusses no photographs or other images in this context, nor does she dig deeply into the gelatin commodity chain or the historical archives of Eastman Kodak. But her penetrating observation here prompted me to spend several weeks with those archives in Rochester, New York. My research unearthed a trove of gelatinous evidence that I'm now beginning to fathom and parse. What has become clear to me already is that gelatin merits eco-critical consideration as a material that connects photography with a far-reaching network of industrial production and consumption premised on reification, the transformation of living beings by the millions into an abstract thing at once invisible and essential to photography. The idea of reification has long reverberated in Marxist theory, from Lukács to Althusser and beyond, but here is the key passage from Marx himself in Capital. "A commodity," he says, "is therefore a mysterious thing, simply because in it the social character of men's labor appears to them as an objective character stamped upon the product of that labor, because the relation of the producers to the sum total of their labor is presented to them as a social relation existing not between themselves, but between the product of their labor. This is the reason the products of labor become commodities, social things whose qualities are at the same time perceptible and imperceptible by the senses. It is only a definite social relation between men that assumes, in their eyes, the fantastic form of a relation between things. End quote. Marx's reference here to a mysterious thing, at once perceptible and imperceptible, aptly describes gelatin as an emulsion material made of formerly living beings, rendered visible through chemical purification, yet ubiquitous and crucial to the production of photographs. However, an eco-critical perspective on photographic gelatin arguably expands Marxist analysis by viewing the social character of labor and social relations in more than human terms. After all, gelatin and photography are not merely the products of what Marx calls men's labor, or a social relation between men, since countless cows have contributed their lives to its fantastic form. In gelatin silverprint photography, we are literally looking at cows, not just as subject matter, but as the material surface and substrate of the visual artifact. As proof of how easy it is to overlook or forget this fact, not even Schuken, the Marxist, mentions gelatin's implication in the cover image of her book, an image which, ironically, she does not identify or discuss. Eco-critical interpretation, therefore, not only helps reanimate photographic gelatin by reminding us of its animality, but it also exposes a gap between traditional Marxist political economy and a more expansive biopolitics. Now I want to look more closely at George Eastman's signature innovations in photography, beginning around the turn of the 20th century. Here you see Eastman in an 1890 photograph by Nadar, the famous French portraitist, during one of the American entrepreneur's trips to Europe. At right appear the engines of Eastman's commercial success, a portable package of gelatin-coated dry plates, which had already begun to displace the albumin process used by Nadar, and below, the 1888 Kodak camera, a revolutionary consumer model loaded with gelatin-coated film. As the Nadar portrait suggests, within a decade of founding his company in 1880, Eastman was regularly traveling both abroad and around the US, cultivating various business ventures, including deals for the provision of gelatin in mass quantities to ensure reliable sourcing of the material for his rapidly growing enterprise. In a 1911 letter to one of his representatives in England, under the heading Manufacture of Gelatine, Eastman discussed the installation of a new gelatin production plant in Rochester to be modeled on one in Germany. After ordering his operative to visit and gather information about the German gelatin factory, Eastman discusses how to source his proposed new gelatin plant with what he calls, quote, the clippings of calf skins that we need, end quote, by using middlemen in the meat and leather industries, whom he describes as, quote, the parties who collect them from the slaughterhouses and before they have gone to the tannery. These clippings, he says, consist almost entirely of head skins, including the ears and nose, and also the clippings from the feet, which aggregate to about 2.5 to 3 pounds from each animal. A subsequent letter to the same operative refers to Armour and Company, one of the largest Chicago meat packers, as a source for animal material. In a postscript here, Eastman concludes by saying, quote, our man says it takes 5 pounds of clippings to make 1 pound of gelatin, a calculation that hints at the magnitude of animal material needed for such production. not to mention the breathtaking scale of violence and reification taking place in adjacent industries upon which the commercialization of photography increasingly relied. One particularly violent episode in the emergence of gelatin silverprint photography underscores another aspect of gelatin's irresistible convenience as an emulsion material. In 1881, U.S. military engineers at Willets Point, New York, conducted an experiment to demonstrate the rapid photographic exposure time afforded by gelatin emulsion. Attaching dynamite to the head of an aging mule, the engineers used an electric current to simultaneously trigger its explosion and a camera loaded with gelatin dry plate to capture that explosion. The result was this gelatin silverprint photograph showing the mule beheaded but still standing at the instant of the blast. Although possibly doctored for dramatic effect, the picture offers another clear indication of prevailing biopolitical realities in which non-human life was relentlessly sacrificed on the altar of technological progress and commerce. Those realities become clearer still in this subsequent publication about the experiment in an issue of the periodical Scientific American, where an article titled "Instantaneous Photography" displays before and after illustrations of the exploded mule with a text touting, quote, "the remarkable sensitiveness of photogelatine plates," end quote. In pursuit of speed and convenience in photography, the sensitiveness of gelatin plates clearly mattered more than the ethical sensitivity toward the non-human animal. Ironically, subsequent scientific research at Kodak would demonstrate that the properties of gelatin itself contributed to and even enhanced the sensitiveness of photographic emulsion, revealing a lingering agency in the animal material long after its extraction and reification. Though not a trained scientist himself, George Eastman seems to have understood something about this ineffable animal agency through his many commercial investments in photographic gelatin and countless personal experiments with emulsion. In addition to designing leather bindings for his cameras and promoting the instantaneous exposure of his gelatin plates and films, Eastman hired many scientists to examine photographic gelatin in meticulous detail in order to refine and exploit its properties. One important example of such scientific inquiry is Samuel Edward Shepard's book, Gelatin in Photography, published by Eastman Kodak in 1923. Shepard was a British chemist hired by Eastman in 1913 to run experiments on physical and colloid chemistry at the Kodak Research Laboratory in Rochester. Based on more than a decade of study, Shepard's treatise contains these declarative statements about the significance of gelatin in photography. Quote, "Since all modern photographic processes depend upon the use of gelatin as the medium in which the silver salts are suspended, the properties and behavior of gelatin are of the utmost importance in photographic theory. As is commonly known, gelatin and its humbler relative, glue, are products of animal origin, the result of the action of hot water or steam upon certain tissues and structures of the body. Primarily, it is obtained from the connective tissues by hydrolytic separation from the skeletal, fleshy, and fatty substances which are suspended in it in the organism. Though by manufacture somewhat of an artificial substance of varied character, it has originally a definite physiological and biochemical unity, which may be diminished, but is neither destroyed nor created in the process of preparation." End quote. That last observation by Shepard is particularly interesting, for it acknowledges that even after extensive processing, gelatin retains characteristics of the organism from which it was extracted. Shepard proceeds to explain and illustrate the gelatin process of preparation in exacting detail, including liming, washing, neutralizing, cooking, clarifying or filtering, concentrating, and bleaching. A series of remarkable illustrations shows blown-up elevation views of a cowhide and epidermis at different stages in the gelatin-making process, beginning with a normal calf skin, followed by calf skin after 66 hours in lime water, after 120 hours in lime water, and finally after bathing. As these illustrations suggest, the transformation of living flesh into gelatin entails a gradual process of homogenization and abstraction, leading eventually to liquefaction. In 1930, Eastman Kodak purchased a century-old factory in Peabody, Massachusetts called the American Glue Company, renaming it Eastman Gelatine Corporation. Peabody was the historic center of the Massachusetts leather tanning industry, so it had well-established networks for obtaining animal material. Here we see a bird's eye view of the giant facility, which Kodak needed to meet growing demand for photographic gelatin. Eastman Gelatine Corporation supplied 2/3 of Kodak gelatin during the 20th century, while the company plant in Rochester provided the rest. Demand for gelatin became so great during the 20th century, however, that Eastman Kodak had to supplement American supplies of animal material with cow bones imported from South America. According to a 1957 article in the Boston Herald, Eastman Gelatine produced 2,500 tons of gelatin per year, along with 4,500 tons of fertilizer and animal food products. 2,500 tons of gelatin translates into 5 million pounds, which in turn required roughly 25 million pounds of raw animal material in the form of hides and bones, based on the calculation I quoted earlier from Eastman's correspondence. In the early 21st century, Kodak sold Eastman gelatin to a European conglomerate amid the rise of digital photography and growing legal problems associated with air and water pollution generated by the facility. Digital photography hardly eliminated demand for gelatin in photography, though. To the contrary, gelatin has remained central to photographic printing, and demand has continued to grow, as confirmed by recent market reports like this one stating that, quote, analysis of the photographic gelatin market reveals a positive outlook for the industry, marked by increasing demand for traditional photography products, along with growing popularity of analog photography and the nostalgia associated with it, end quote. As a way of concluding, I display a few of the many photographs George Eastman took of prize cows and calves that he owned and raised on the grounds of his palatial estate in Rochester, New York, and at his rural Oak Lodge retreat in Halifax County, North Carolina. Often given individual names and tended by hired human wranglers, the animals provided Eastman with milk, butter, cheese, and meat for his private consumption. In voluminous personal correspondence, Eastman wrote obsessively to his staff and to agricultural experts about how to optimize his herd for food production. At once pastoral hobby, scientific experiment, and photography project, Eastman's cows revealed his complex personality, which combined impulses of gentleman farmer with corporate industrialist, animal husbandman with mass producer of photographic gelatin. As gelatin prints, these photographs both embody and represent cows, a fact that ecocritical study reveals. Thank you.